Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dana Kuhnline. I'm the program director with Reimagine Appalachia, joining you from sunny Ohio. Excited to see folks rolling into the room. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about disaster resilience. Thanks to our partners at the Central Appalachia Network, who have helped us pull this event together today, as well as to our speakers. I'm so excited to hear from everybody on this issue. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're here and what our goal is with these series. And then as I'm talking, I actually have some questions for you. So the first one, and Liam, if you could drop that in the link in the chat. So this is a kind of a little test for you all to use our polling system and have interactive content. So you can follow the link in the chat, which I can maybe poll for you guys. And then your answers will show up here on the screen. It looks like folks are figuring it out. So as I think many of you know, as we see the answers coming in, flooding is a concern that most or not, if not all of us are familiar with in the region. And hardworking communities across Appalachia are just increasingly vulnerable to extreme rainfall. It's going to be a surprise to nobody that over the last decade, there have been more than 20 federally declared disasters across Central Appalachia, including Hurricane Helene in September 2024, and flooding across Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia in February and April of 2025. These events stymie our ability to do long-term economic development and hit communities in hundreds of ways, many of which we're going to talk about on the call today. There are even the threat and if for folks just joining us, you can click that link in the chat and your answers will show up on the screen. I'll give folks just a minute with this question and we'll move to the next one. So as we're going to talk about today, there are a lot of challenges that the region is facing, but there's also a lot of opportunities to increase our resilience to flooding. And on the webinar today, we're going to hear some from different ways that folks are approaching this issue from different angles and how communities can prepare, as well as what happens after a flood, how they can be ready for what comes next. We're not going to cover every angle. That's just impossible to do so. The issue is huge and complex, which I think you'll see reflected across our presentations, which is why we're doing a whole series. So this is the first in our series, our future webinars. And Liam, if you want to drop the links in the chat so folks can see a list of all the different webinars that we have coming up. Our future webinars are going to address issues such as nature-based strategies to reduce flood impacts, what we can learn from mutual aid and disaster workers around flood preparation and as well as recovery, and other topics that are going to be in those links that Liam's dropping. So if you want to get registered for all of those, there are monthly events that are going to be happening monthly from now until October. And during the second half of this call, we will have some time for you to answer some questions for us to help us actually shape the content for those webinars, especially the ones that are farther out. One resource that I'm going to talk about is the Appalachian Flood Policy Platform, which was created with partners at Appalachian Citizens Law Center and the National Wildlife Federation, where we tried to identify some of the issues of flooding that are unique to the region. So I'm going to cover those in just a minute. We have another question here that is just about the roles that you play in your community. And so I want to say, I know that all of you play a lot of roles, so you actually can answer all 8 if you want. And if you answer other, feel free to put the answer in the chat. That is the correct answer for you. For folks who are just joining us, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We see these calls as an opportunity for networking. If you're working on flooding issues, if you want to share about your work in the chat, we'd love to see links to what you're doing, upcoming events that you all may have, studies, research, information that you want to share. That's really appreciated if you can put that in the chat, because we all are here to learn from each other. And as you can see from the poll, folks are filling out that there is so much expertise that is in the room that folks are bringing to the table. And I do not know why the other is black. That is weird, and I did not do that on purpose. And Minty did that to me. I don't mean to like put you all as a different color. They're brown or whatever for folks who aren't fitting into the poll. I know most of us, like I said, we wear so many hats. We fit into all different kinds of places. So I think that is, yeah, I'm gonna end this slide. And we're gonna get to some of those questions in a minute. So what I want to talk about a little bit is, Molly, I should have just had you share my screen, but I'm getting it. See, I have to switch presentations, and Molly was going to do it for me, and then I said, I think I have it, but
do you want me to?
Do you mind? I'm just like
Yeah.
a mess. I'm a mess. I'm trying to share screens, and I'm totally falling apart. So thank you. It's a team.
Oh, good.
As I said, share your stuff in the chat. We're all a team here. So So just one kind of framework to start us off with. We're going to talk about a couple different sorts of frameworks as we go through the webinar today. So first, the flood policy platform. This was created by a couple hundred interviews and people asking folks to fill out surveys over the course of 2024. And what we did was we asked folks kind of what the problems that they were seeing around flooding, and we categorized those into 4 basic pillars, just to have a way to kind of capture and quantify those. There are other types of pillars. There's other ways to capture and quantify, but the question we were asking was, what are some of the uniquely Appalachian, specific to Appalachia issues with flooding that we're seeing in the region? And that's what this policy platform tried to address. If you could go to the next slide, Molly. So this is, and I think Andrew has a very similar slide. So when we look at like the landscape of how you deal with flooding, it's alphabet soup. And so one of the first sections of the platform is just a very long definitions. And so if you're looking for definitions, we have a whole bunch of them in that document, because there are so many letters in flood policy and in flood work. It's pretty overwhelming. You can go to the next slide. I just wanted to kind of showcase the number of acronyms that we ran into as we started to kind of get our heads around what this work can look like. So the first pillar that we identified as a unique barrier or concern that Appalachians face when it comes to flooding is the local and state capacity. So there is this expectation that local governments and local communities are going to be the first responders when floods hit, but there is not the funding to back them up and support them to move to be in that role. And so you have some communities that are more ready, that have found the capacity in one way or another to do really robust flood resiliency and flood preparation projects. And we have many, many others, the vast majority, that have one thing we found over and over again was that so many communities knew exactly what they wanted, and they didn't have the funding to implement it. And they knew what was needed. They'd done the studies, and they just didn't have the funding to actually do the things that the studies recommended, et cetera. So we can go to the next one. So just increasing that local and state capacity for flood resiliency and flood recovery. The second one is around the recovery burdens, and this is another issue that has a particular intersection in Appalachia, because we do have rural communities, we have high, low income communities. And so you have a lot of folks who are hit particularly hard after disasters because they don't have the funds to pick up and move. You all know this information, right? But it's when we're thinking about how to kind of distill down and communicate this outside the region to articulate the particular ways that we're getting hit hardest by flooding and disasters, this was the second piece of the story that we decided to tell. You can go to the next one, Molly. So some of the particular intersections of how the Appalachian communities are particularly stymied and harmed by the increase in flooding is that we have an overall housing crisis. We have a shortage of housing altogether outside, and Andrew's going to talk a lot more about this during his presentation. We have a lot of issues with housing. We have historic poverty, but poverty is exacerbated by flooding. And so there's a bit of a kind of a ripple effect or expansion effects when we have a low-income community that's hit by flooding. That's a huge economic burden that is going to increase the economic struggles that that community is facing. And then we do have a historic disproportion in how funds are distributed after flooding. So more affluent. Sierra, all of this is in that longer report that Liam shared, and we can drop that again. Absolutely. Yeah, it's got a lot of citations in there. Thanks, Liam. Yeah, and so I think I'm on 3.
Sorry, yeah, it's clicking ahead of me.
Sometimes it
Try
gets
to get
excited.
back. It keeps
Um,
going forward, not back. Give me just a
yeah,
second.
so that's okay. And like I said, Andrew and Natalie and our other speakers are going to touch on some of these issues, but we do, we see a particular burden that is then increasing. So you can go to the next one because that links together. The next slide. So with flood mapping, another historic issue we have is that Appalachian communities and rural communities broadly tend to have less accurate flood maps, either out-of-date flood maps, or because our topography is so dramatic, you'll have people who are in a flood map that are actually on top of a mountain, but they got sort of looped in there because they're not that far as the crow flies from the creek bed, but they are definitely not on the creek bed. And so we have a lot of issues with inaccurate flood mapping and a lot of other issues. So for example, flood tracking rising waters, stream gauges, things. So, we have communities that are, the way that they tell if a flood is coming is if by just standing on a bridge and waiting to watch the water rise, versus other communities that I'm on the Ohio River, and we have flood gauges. We know exactly how high the water is and when it's expected to crest. And so there's a big technology gap. Go to the next one. I'm almost done. So another issue that escalates upon itself, similar to the poverty issue with flooding, is nature-based hazard mitigation. So obviously Appalachia has a history of extraction. And so, for example, surface mine sites are heavily compacted for engineering reasons to reduce the amount of water that is leaching out of those sites. So it reduces the amount of chemical pollution that would be coming off those sites because those sites are heavily compacted, which makes a lot of sense, except now those sites don't absorb water. They have a similar absorption letter as a parking lot absorption ability as a parking lot, but they don't have the sort of planned drainage that a urban center would have. And so we have a lot of sites that reforestation and other remediation of those sites would increase their ability, like a sponge, to absorb water in a high rainfall event. But that's a lot of work that needs done. And then the second thing is that the more that sites are impacted by flooding, then the next flood comes and they are more unstable, they're more degraded. And so when communities are hit again and again by flooding, and I think we saw this in the North Carolina floods, we've seen it in the Virginia floods, then the next time around, then those nature-based kind of stopgaps are less able to stop the flow of water, so that the next flood can be more severe. You can switch to the next one. So the 3 areas that teased out was about mine land reclamation, thinking about how we can log more responsibly to prevent these concerns, and agricultural improvements, because sustainable agriculture has the potential to absorb several times the amount of water. Anyway, I'm going to wrap at that, and Molly, you can stop the screen share, because I definitely want you all to hear from our other speakers. And so Robert Kell with this Central Appalachian Network's CROG team is going to talk to us next, and Robert's going to zoom farther back out and talk about disaster resilience broadly.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. First, can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Perfect. And can you also see the slide?
Looks good.
Perfect. Hey, everyone. So I'm with our working group, one of the many working groups of the Central Appalachian Network. And as a training working group, we wanted to really be able to offer a foundational, just like, what are we talking about when we're talking about, in this case, predominantly disaster resilience, but really, what is resilience? And we found this really great National Academies resource that sort of lays out resilience as a 4-phased idea. Okay, now, is it clicking? So we know, like Dana just outlined, the storms are coming and we've seen the impact. And so really the question is, how are we responding and adapting? And I love the fact that we started with the flood policy platform, because that's one of the ways in which we are responding and adapting, is to make sure that policymakers are understanding the situation. But what are we doing in our communities? So what is resilience? And I think this is a really easy collective place to start, and it's the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. So this is coming right from that National Academy's publication. They really stress that resilience is a process. It's not an endpoint. It is a process that we keep refining and coming back to. And when we focus on local systems and community strengths, we can do it even better. So in the first part of our process is preparation. It includes having a wide variety of community voices and engagement strategies, different types of resource planning, and then equitable access to those systems and support. So it really is thinking about before, we've identified risk, we've built plans, we've strengthened our relationships in our community. And just like a good example of what it looks like to be prepared is, a local church or a fire department hosting some type of preparation training that invites folks to donate batteries for a resource library. So it's really thinking about the systems and ways and networks that we have a plan for. So that's before. Absorbing is what it looks like to support each other during the storm. We measure this by how strong our social networks are, our emergency services, what type of backup infrastructure we might have, how we're communicating to each other. It shows up through mutual aid networks, neighbor to neighbor support, our community's ability to keep things, our most essential services like food and medical care alive for us. So really absorbing and supporting us in the shock of a storm. One of the key pieces that the National Academies wanted to hit home was the fact that when you have redundant infrastructure or infrastructure that is backing itself up, then you are more resilient, and that shock doesn't come equitably across our communities, right? Some folks are more vulnerable, like the elder and low-income folks. So a good example of what it would look like to prepare for a shock is to have a rooftop solar system and a backup battery on a local community center, so folks can come and charge their phones and have electricity for medical equipment. Recovery. So what are we doing right after the storm, right? It's not just, it's about our ability to get our stability back, to be healthy and to belong in our community. It is about listening to those who have been impacted, making space for healing while we think about the actual infrastructure that surrounds us. And recovery, quick and equitable access to support is key. So good examples of this is having FEMA application support services, tool banks where folks can come and borrow critical tools that we don't easily have access to, mutual aid networks that are established to get us diapers and food and all of the supplies that we might need, public facilities that are opened up for showers and washing clothes. And then the flood policy platform also hinted to this. So the last phase of resilience here is adapting to a future where we are going to have more storms. So this is about reducing our future risk, right? Learning from the past storms, strengthening our infrastructure and our community's capacity. So examples of what it looks like to adapt is designing floodplains by adding green spaces and incorporating natural storm mitigation like wetlands. So yes, the policy platform says, hey, state of Virginia, you should be helping communities pay for these mitigation efforts, but adapting is encouraging this type of development in our community, or even something even more simple, which is relocating the essential services to a designated community hub before a storm even arrives, right? So again, we could be more prepared. So in summary, and what we want to be able to offer through this training series, and just as a foundational place to be in conversation with each other, is that resiliency is a community-centered process. It's preparing before the storm, supporting each other during, recovering equitably after, and adapting together for a safer future. So I hope that can help kick us off. And I think I pass it to Della next.
You've queued Della up perfectly.
Thanks,
You
Robert.
excited to do it.
Thank you so much. I don't have slides, but if you want to pull up the mini grants page, that would be a helpful screen landing for us to look at. I'm Della McGuire. I'm also with Robert on the Community Resilience and Adaptation Working Group with the Central Appalachian Network, and I'm a grant writer for Appalachian Sustainable Development. I am really excited to give y'all this grant opportunity that CAN Network just dropped in the chat, the mini grant, and it's $5,000 to $12,000. It's due June 27th. If you were listening to Robert's brilliant presentation and got some ideas for some of these great projects you want to start, this is a really good way to get some of those funds into your community for an implementation project or a community resilience project of some sort. So tell us your idea. The application is very brief, and we wanted to make it very accessible to folks who maybe are new to grant writing. It could be a great starter practice grant. You could apply for a project to do some capacity building work or implementation work or community stories of cultural experiences you may have had in your community. We would like to know, what are you doing? What is resiliency looking like in your community? What kinds of projects do you want to do? And tell us a little bit about it. And we're going to try and get out as much of this, as much of these projects as possible. The funding comes from the Mosaic grant that Central Appalachia Network received to be able to provide some community resilience and natural disaster recovery kinds of projects and promote arts and community culture around environmental issues. So whatever that means to you in whatever project you have, we would love to hear about it. Thank you, Kara, for dropping the Mosaic link. That will tell you a little bit more about the kind of transformative projects we want to see. And it's not a lot of money, but it can be used as matching funds for another project. So if it's a small piece of a larger project, that's okay. We love to see partnerships. So tell us who, in your community are you collaborating with to make this project come to life. And we have left an open-ended question at the end because the October 14 training session is all about stories of disaster recovery. So we want to get some of those stories. So beyond the regular application of a couple pages, we're only asking for like 1,000 words. So beyond that little brief summary, if you would like to provide us an additional little bit of information to contribute to this amazing story collection project, the communications team over at the CROG working group, they're doing some great story collecting. We're wanting to sort of populate that effort right off the bat as an additional optional question on this grant fund. So I will happily take any questions at the end if y'all want to put those in the chat. I do want to just have a quick statement about the federal funding landscape. I am a federal grant writer primarily. I have recently had to pivot to focusing on foundation funding, and it's pretty bleak out there. But just to illustrate the potential for opportunities there, if you were part of the 2022 flooding, where you have been, if your community had a disaster declared in 2022, there is still some of that $50 million allocation left available. So if you or someone, a community near you, has been declared a disaster in 2022, please go get the rest of that money. The other flood mitigation grant linked to a Western North Carolina, I'm not sure, because 2022 was very specific, and I don't know if they included any funding on 24 when the hurricane came to the mountains. Like, that's not enough of a sign that there's a problem. There may be special funding for Western North Carolina. I have not seen. The flood mitigation grant, it's one states can apply to. So their upcoming future flood mitigation funding would be eligible. If you have contacts at your state government level, please encourage them to apply so your state will be eligible for some of this additional flood mitigation funding. Generally speaking, the grants.gov search engine has, thousands of grants that may be eligible to lots of different projects. Putting in flood gives me these two, and that's it. So the landscape is bleak, but it's temporary, and the money will flow again. So if you can, hold out for the Fed to come back. This is as much my own pep talk as anybody else's. That being said, there are private funding sources out there like our mini grant available right now. So if you want to start a project, but it's huge, we can help with planning grant funds. Please apply. Encourage your friends to apply. We want to give I think we can give 12 to 15 grants depending on how much people are asking for. I think there's $150,000 total.
Stella,
So
can you tell
yeah.
us what states can apply? Are there any restrictions on that?
Appalachia, generally.
So Pennsylvania is included.
If you are officially Appalachia, it counts.
Awesome.
Yes, we're trying to be as broad as possible about that. It's not national, it's definitely an Appalachia money. But make the case if you're in one of those sort of periphery states that you're working in Appalachia. Yeah. And I think that's all I've got. So please, you can put questions in the chat. I'll be here the whole time. And I will pass to Miss Natalie Cruz Daniels. Dr. Natalie Cruz Daniels, my extreme apologies. You rock. Take it away.
No worries. I don't get hung up on titles very often. I'm just trying to share my screen, y'all. All right, can you see that?
Looks
Yeah,
great.
it's great.
Okay, great. I am really happy to be with y'all today to talk about some of the work that we've done, really both asking communities and listening to both things that folks are doing and needs in terms of extreme weather resilience in Central Appalachia. So this is based on several years of work with a bunch of partners across Central Appalachia, including Ohio University, where I am, West Virginia University, and Virginia Tech. So this, kind of links back to what Robert was talking about, but really when we talk about resilience, we're talking about that ability to bounce back from a disturbance. And there's a lot of, thoughts about what that really means and how to do that in an equitable way, right? Because if we keep asking people who get flooded over and over and over again just to bounce back, that's inequity, right? And so really thinking about how as a community we can equitably prepare, absorb a shock, recover and adapt, using that framework, not expecting folks to just, weather the storm themselves, but really prepare our communities in that way. And so that can look like a lot of different things, right? That can look like infrastructure and physical systems. It can look like social and community networks. We know that places with stronger community fabric and stronger community networks tend to be more resilient, with consistent resource allocations. Can look like emergency response plans and communication of that, economic recovery, and really focusing on this equity. I say this a lot, so apologies if folks have heard me say this before, but You know, when you're driving on your summer vacation and you see all these billboards for ready.gov and how you should be packing your, emergency kit, what that leaves out is, yeah, I'm really lucky to be able to have some backup water and flashlight and, non-perishable food, but that's not everyone's reality. And so we can't expect households to just go it alone. So when we think about that compounded vulnerability in Central Appalachia, we're thinking about, the economic conditions that come from post-coal economies, the distribution of population, where a lot of folks are in more isolated communities, which makes both access and leaving can be more challenging when you have impacts to roads. A lot of our settlement patterns in floodplains where critical infrastructure is in the flood zone or close to it creates an additional layer of vulnerability. A lot of our communities don't have stormwater infrastructure, or if they did, it's outdated or, doesn't keep up with the current level of rainfall and runoff. And then we have all this land disturbance from extractive industry that changes how water responds in our hills and in our mountains. And then widespread poor social determinants of health that make people more vulnerable. So generally, when we think about those climate projections, we're talking about higher intensity storms, both rainstorms and winter storms, increased heat and drought, and warmer winters. So a couple of those vulnerabilities, and Dana talked about this in the flood policy platform. They talk about floodplains and floodplain mapping. And often what we see is that the floodplains can do a decent job for aerial flooding, so like for the rivers flooding out. But oftentimes what's missed in these are places that have frequent flash flooding, where it's, how is the water making it to the river rather than how is the water leaving the river. And so we need to be able to consider both those things when we think about who's vulnerable in flooding. And again, I said this earlier, this is Marlinton, West Virginia, where just kind of shows this really well, where all the settlement is really on that floodplain and the town is built right at the confluence of multiple rivers. And so you end up with this sort of consistent legacy settlement setup where you have, a stream, a road, and a house in a confined valley. And so it just increases that vulnerability. And then that land use and extractive industry. So between logging, mining, reclamation, and oil and gas operations, we end up with increased compaction of our soils, reduced forest cover, lower infiltration in our soils. And then you also have slurry ponds, which we know are a risk, and just reduced natural attenuation. So like less natural absorbance of stormwater. And so we know, and this is an image from the CDC. I'm actually not sure if this is publicly available anymore, but we know that those impacts of climate change and increased storm events affect health, right? Whether it's air pollution mapping onto asthma or severe weather leading to injuries and mental health impacts, or whether it has to do with mold and other vector-borne illness in flooding. We know that there's an impact on people's health, and that then adds that layer of vulnerability. And I mentioned this earlier, but this idea of social terms of health really frame our vulnerability. And so when we think about how we need to prepare, these systematic things around education and healthcare access and food access and the built environment and economic stability all give us, if we can improve those things, if we can, improve those social determinants of health, then we can also reduce our vulnerability. All right. So we did listening sessions and interviews and surveys with public health leaders from across Central Appalachia. And these are some of the voices that I think are really worth amplifying here. So this idea that, that the level of poverty increases the vulnerability, and where we have children and grandparents, so really highlighting the vulnerability of young people and older adults that might not eat anything until they can be accessed after a disaster. People highlighted mental health mental health issues, and really the trauma that comes from repeated disasters. This idea of trying to foster preparedness and being proactive rather than reactive. And then, people talked about things like, folks not wanting to go to shelters because they'd have to leave their pets behind, or people who lack mobility being able to access resources and access shelter. And then the idea of repeated disasters, right? That it's not just one storm or one flood, it's flood after flood, or flood after drought after flood, that really impacts our communities. So when we look at things folks are doing and things that folks wanted to do in the region to make our communities more resilient, in preparation, a lot of it was around broadband and communication. So how are we going to communicate before, during, and after a disaster? Broadband access was certainly part of that, but also, folks talked about things like, Amish prayer chains as a way to talk to people, local Facebook groups, websites, radio, all of these things, right? But that communications planning has to be really clear. Planning across agencies, so making sure the sheriff and the health department and the emergency management agency and the health clinic all have talked to each other. Planning for emergency shelter ahead of time. Working with first responders like community health workers in our communities to be trained on emergency response and disaster response, and digitization of records. We see in multiple storm events where you have, flooded basements or whatever, in community, county, township buildings where records are lost, and that really impacts people into the future, whether it comes to, their identity, their birth certificate, things like that. During responses, really working on things like social media communication. We see a lot of disaster communication happening on Facebook. We all know in this room that that leaves people out, right? There are people who are going to have access and use that resource, and there are people who won't. So in some recent work, some students of mine looked at emergency management in Central Appalachia, and who had a website and publicly available materials on the web versus who was using Facebook or other social media. And by and large, that emergency communication is happening on Facebook. But we know that there are people who aren't part of that. And so finding ways to expand that net and make sure that that communication is clear, widespread, and equitable. I talked about Amish prayer chains and grocery storefront communication. Emergency text systems are pretty ubiquitous throughout the region now using HyperReach. And so ensuring that you have the communication and education of community members to join the emergency text alert system. And then we know that throughout our region, neighbor to neighbor support and communication is critical. When we look at that recovery and adaptation, really having those central and trusted access to services and relief is really critical. So we heard a lot of stories of, FEMA setting up outside of town, or, setting up really not in an easily accessible place. And so ensuring that that is based in a local trusted resource is enormous. The long-term mental health supports for community members and first responders were brought up multiple times. And then that idea of coordination between faith-based and nonprofit organizations. And we saw this after Helene. Lots of folks jumped in to help, but the coordination of aid and support and sorting donations and things like that is really critical when we talk about response and recovery. And then giving space for community sharing and group sharing to tell our stories and recover. So these are things that came from folks who we worked with. We did some mini grants through this as well, and so this is just seeding with some more ideas. These mini grants are smaller than the ones that Della talked about, but people did things like dehumidification for emergency supply storage, weather radios for schools, major trauma first aid kits, wet and cold weather gear for mobile health units for emergency response, lights, fans, and refrigeration for shelters and generator accessible areas for medicines, for cooling, and for work in the darker and in other weather. And so just, summarizing some of those main resource and capacity needs were scenario development and tabletop planning. And how do we do that in our communities? Communication and broadband, planning ahead for shelter and services to our most vulnerable populations, mental health support, housing. I say that as this one-liner, as if it's an easy nut to crack when we know it's an enormous issue. And then insurance, mutual aid, and outside help, and how we coordinate those things in our region, particularly when communication is down. The Central Appalachian Network Community Resilience and Adaptation Working Group, we are working on a resource library for the region. So putting together resources and helping make them accessible to communities and not-for-profit groups in the region, and building out essentially a regional toolkit for emergency response planning is one of the things that we are working towards as a group. And if you have resources or ideas or needs that you might be able to share, we would really appreciate that. And we've got some questions at the end of this session that we'll also engage with or ask that again as well. So I just wanted to queue up that this is on its way, and hopefully is a resource that folks will be able to use. I really appreciate you listening to me for a minute and for letting me share some of the work that we've done and insights from communities we've spoken with. I get to pass it off to Andrew Bates from FAHI now. I'm going to stop my share so you can.
All right. I'll screen up here. Look good?
Yep.
It's good. Sounds good.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Bates. I'm a state advocacy coordinator at FAHI. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the resources that are available after a disaster, and with a bit of a lens on housing in particular. And unfortunately, my slides are not as pretty as Robert's or Natalie's, but please bear with me. So FAHI is an organization that wears a lot of hats. We're a community development financial institution certified by the Treasury. We're a network of nonprofit housing providers across Central and Southern Appalachia. We are a mortgage lender through our Just Choice Lending subsidiary. And we're also a regional advocacy and research organization, which is more where my role comes in. And we operate in the Appalachian parts of Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, Alabama, and Maryland. And so this is similar to a slide that Dana had, but I did just want to take a moment to kind of recognize that there's a lot at play here in disaster recovery, and I would describe it as too much and not enough. It's too much in that there are so many different agencies, programs, and funding sources involved, and there's no real clearinghouse that like ties it all together. So it can quickly overwhelm small communities that probably have low staff capacity and are of course already reeling from a disaster. And it's not enough in the sense that, not everyone can be made whole after a disaster, given the available resources. Some people might have lacked flood insurance after a previous flood and therefore be ineligible for FEMA individual assistance for the next flood. We've seen that in Kentucky. Some people might lose their jobs permanently. Renters might lose their homes and have no immediate options, and as a result end up homeless or having to move to a new community. And then, some cities and counties might not receive enough funding to fully repair lost infrastructure. So with all of that in mind, I mean, population loss is certainly a huge concern, especially for small communities following a disaster. But there's still a lot available, and so we'll go ahead and get into that. So in the immediate response phase, this is days to weeks to a few months after a disaster. There's a few big categories of assistance available. One is FEMA's individual assistance, which covers temporary housing and immediate repairs for individuals and households. There's also FEMA public assistance in these first two categories, A and B, which include debris removal and emergency protective measures, which can be a variety of things, some of which are listed here. And so that's things like muck outs, immediate cleanup, debris removal from roads, stuff like that, as well as, those immediate emergency services like from search and rescue to firefighting to, even things like childcare and medical care. There's also the Small Business Administration disaster loans, which are available to small businesses that are impacted as well as certain individuals. And then a big category that is, I would say, inconsistently available, depending on the location, is claims under the National Flood Insurance Program. This is perhaps more relevant for communities that, experience like frequent riverine flooding, where it's fairly predictable. It's less so for the communities that are affected by flash flooding. In the 2022 Eastern Kentucky floods, which I'll be talking about quite a bit, because that's really the disaster that I and Fahi have the most familiarity with. Only about 5% of the impacted homes had flood insurance. So it's certainly not something to be relied upon necessarily in a disaster. And not to mention, private philanthropy, charity, and religious organizations are active throughout the response and recovery phases. So then there's the short-term recovery phase, which is more like months after a disaster. So there is the remaining categories of FEMA public assistance, which are more for repair and reconstruction of kind of crucial public utilities, buildings, and facilities, as well as things like parks. Then there is FEMA Transitional Sheltering Assistance, which is intended to help people find kind of temporary housing while they wait for a more permanent rehoming option. The Department of Labor also offers disaster unemployment assistance to people who have lost their jobs. And then another thing that FEMA does is they will provide temporary housing units, which are essentially just travel trailers for up to 18 months if needed after a disaster. So those were deployed in the Eastern Kentucky floods and really, kept a lot of people, frankly, off the streets. So then the long-term recovery phase, and I think this is what we'll focus on the most. There is the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is a pretty broad program that funds a lot of just hazard mitigation. It helps states and localities develop a plan to mitigate future disasters and provides funding to do so to implement those plans. The Economic Development Administration does offer disaster recovery grants for economic revitalization and job creation to get the local economies back up and running. And then HUD's Community Development Block Grants for Disaster Recovery, or CDBG-DR. Those are probably the biggest bucket of funding that is available after disaster. It is congressionally appropriated in just a big lump sum to states. It has a very wide range of uses, requires no local match, which is great. And it is capped theoretically at 80% AMI. But that is a little bit flexible as I'll get to. And then finally, there are throughout the recovery process, there are buyout programs available. So we talked about minimizing future risk through mitigation, and one way to do so is to essentially influence people to move out of the floodplain, and then to prevent further construction in a floodplain. And these programs have to be applied for and administered by localities or states, but there are a number of them available. The USDA operates an emergency watershed protection program, which for the Kentucky floods provided appraised value pre-disaster plus $31,000 to homeowners who were willing to give up their current residence and put an easement on their property to prevent future development. They did retain certain rights of like access, hunting and fishing to that land, but just were not able to build anything on it. FEMA has a buyout program under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. FEMA also has a separate flood mitigation assistance program that does buyouts for homes that had flood insurance. And then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers also operates a flood risk management buyout program. Not to mention CDBG-DR can be used by states and localities for buyouts. There was another FEMA buyout program called BRIC, but that has been discontinued by the Trump administration. And there are some issues with buyout programs. The timing is an issue. It can take, months to years to coordinate buyouts between, the local government applying, the funding being awarded, and then the requisite paperwork actually being completed. And it's reliant on local governments that are probably understaffed and overworked in the wake of disaster. Not everyone is going to be able to get a buyout. You obviously would have to own your home to get one. And it introduces some concerns about duplication of benefits because if someone takes a buyout, they may not later on be eligible to receive a subsidized new home without staking the money that they received through the buyout, which because that money is given in a lump sum, it can create some challenges around making sure that people are holding on to that money to then be able to get a new home, because there is just a natural tendency for people to kind of burn through some of that money, whether it's on completely understandable things like temporary housing or things like vacations. I mean, both of those are things that we've seen in the Eastern Kentucky flood recovery process. So there, that might be a paternalistic kind of concern to have, but it is certainly a real thing. Because if someone goes into a disaster with a lot of home equity built up and then all of a sudden cashes out and then spends that money down before getting a new home, they're going to be in a worse situation than they were before. But a little bit more on CDBG-DR, which, as I mentioned, is the biggest bucket of funding here. It is, like I said, congressionally appropriated, and it goes to states to then divvy up to cities and counties. Sometimes larger cities and counties will receive direct allocations, but that was not the case for the Kentucky floods in 2022. You have to use 80% of CDBG-DR in the federally designated most impacted areas. The remaining 20% can be used in the most impacted areas that are designated by the state. It can take months or years to become available, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And the uses are many, but anything that has to do with disaster relief, long-term recovery, economic revitalization, infrastructure, and housing will typically be eligible. And there is a separate kind of subcategory of CDBG-DR, which is the mitigation CDBG MIT, which is specifically for future disaster mitigation. And a bit about the income qualification for CDBG-DR. Generally, most of the funding has to be used for low to moderate income populations, which according to HUD is 80% and below area median income. The remaining 30% can be used for slum and blight mitigation or to meet what is called an urgent need, which requires application to HUD for something to be determined as an urgent need. And then there are waivers, though. Kentucky actually was able to get a waiver to use the state median income, which is significantly higher than the area median income in the counties that were affected, which just makes it easier to serve a lot more people that need help. But there are some pretty serious challenges with CDBG-DR. It has to be appropriated through a political process, so that it is subject to the whims of Congress. States and localities do tend to prioritize infrastructure repair, which, is understandable because that is, directly under the purview of state and local governments. But it can leave housing as well as, even economic revitalization kind of underfunded. Uh, there's just a lack of capacity at the local level to administer the huge amounts of funding that are available. And there also are some issues with income qualification in that in poor, this is a bit of a Fahy soapbox, but in poor rural counties, it's often very difficult, even for a relatively low earning household, to qualify as low income or LMI for the purposes of federal programs. Um, and then there's a timing gap of a very long time, which I'll get to on the next slide. So while that CDBGDR is pending, there's a risk of population loss, long-term economic hardship, and homelessness. And so I mentioned the timing gap. This is credit to SBP, which is the St. Bernard's Project, which does a lot of disaster recovery kind of consulting work in the way, they were founded in the wake of Katrina. But they put together this sort of timeline to show that there's about a 3/4 of a year at minimum gap until HUD finally awards CDBGDR. It can be more than a year. It can actually, in fact, be, in the case of the Eastern Kentucky floods, it can be about 1,000 days, which is what we're seeing. And so you have, all of these resources available in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. But because of all of the steps involved with CDBGDR, the political process of appropriating the money, and then the long action plan design and stakeholder review that has to take place before getting the state's plan approved by HUD, can eventually create this just kind of nonsensical gap of a matter of years. Not to mention the priorities that states will identify for CDBGDR are not always proportional to the identified needs. So this is from the Kentucky CDBGDR Action Plan for 2022. It shows that housing had about $70 million more remaining unmet need at the time of the creation of the action plan, but actually, compared to infrastructure, but actually received lower allocation of CDBGDR funding than infrastructure did. And this is in an environment in which we had about 9,000 homes damaged and about 4,500 with major damage and 542 destroyed. And then this just kind of shows that, despite this being a huge amount of funding, it's not always going to be enough to fully fund the damage to the housing stock in a community. This is based on an analysis by the Ohio River Valley Institute and the ACLC that showed. So the middle bar here is the cost to rebuild in place, and then the bottom bar is the cost to rebuild the homes that were affected and move them out of the floodplain, which was really a priority for the state government as well as a lot of nonprofit advocates, including Fahy. And as you can see, the available resources really did not even cover the rebuild in place cost, which that in combination with the timing gap, I think really points to the need for flexible state funding. And so a quick plug for the Kentucky Rural Housing Trust Fund, which was established in 2023 after a joint effort by the Kentucky nonprofit housing community to secure some dedicated disaster housing recovery funds. It was split between the Western Kentucky tornadoes and the Eastern Kentucky floods of recent years, but it did go up to 120% AMI. So it was very flexible and it was able to be blended with existing resources. And that was renewed in 2024. And so quickly, I do want to touch on the kind of unique role that Fahi has been playing in Eastern Kentucky recovery, which is in some ways similar to the work that SBP does with, kind of consulting for communities following disasters. But, a number of problems existed, including the lack of expertise and capacity, both at the state and local levels, to administer this kind of funding, especially, as far as housing is concerned. And just, too many players being involved between the governor's office, the state agencies, HUD, local ad districts, nonprofits, et cetera. And so Fahi was pretty well positioned to step into a kind of administrative clearinghouse sort of role. We have a large network of nonprofits able to actually build stuff. We have, strong relationships at the local level, a good reputation with the state, especially due to the leading role that we had in the recovery from the 2021 floods that mainly affected Breathitt County and surrounding counties. And we had capacity to expand our staff. So one thing that we're doing is we're providing kind of a grant consulting work for local communities in leveraging CDBG-DR. So we're helping them with project development, completing their applications, enlisting the developer, and then kind of managing the development project throughout. And this is especially useful because Kentucky, for some reason, requires localities to have a CDBG-DR, or excuse me, a CDBG certified administrator, which is just not something that our rural Eastern Kentucky communities are going to have. We also have a direct contract with the Commonwealth to do intake, just kind of really for any flood impacted person who just wants to find out what's available for them and like what's their best option. There we have a form online at housingcan'twait.org to connect people with available resources, provide housing and financial counseling, et cetera. We are also doing the construction management essentially for the high ground communities that the governor and Team Kentucky have been working on. These are new subdivisions intended to move people out of harm's way, generally built on abandoned mining lands that are flat and able to be developed. And then finally, we are also regionally managing the rehab and reconstruction portion of Kentucky's CDBG-DR allocation. This will be available to anyone whose home was damaged by the floods, but this is still being rolled out, which is another reminder that CDBG-DR moves very slowly. But we will have a direct intake process that will not go through local governments, which will be a good bit more efficient and centralized. But that's the kind of unique role that we're playing. But we are, certainly trying to replicate this work as much as possible, or to the extent that it is needed in other places. We've been doing some consulting in Tennessee, as well as Western North Carolina, following Helene. And so it's something that we're kind of, I think, turning into maybe more of a consistent business line, just to continue to help support communities that lack the capacity to fully leverage the funding that's available after disaster. But that's all I got, and I appreciate everybody paying attention, and once again appreciate Reimagine and CAN for having me on.
Thank you so much. Oh, that was so much rich information. As I noted, I know some folks do have to leave at the hour, which the recording will be sent to all folks, but we do have another half hour on the agenda for a little bit more conversation with you all. So we want to move into Q&A. But as part of our Q&A, we have questions for you too. So I see some folks have already filled this initial question out. Here's the link again. It looks like some of y'all are on it, but for folks who need that link again, there's that link. So I'm gonna have these screens going in the background so we can have a little bit of an interactive Q&A. Please drop your questions in the chat if you do have questions for our speakers. I I just noted one, and I may have missed others, but there was one about folks, the best flood mapping resources, and a couple of resources were noted in the chat. Natalie, I saw you responded to that. I just wanted to double check that if any of other speakers or anybody else on the call has any flood mapping resources that they would want to make sure folks are aware of, or to kind of share that knowledge. That's okay if not. Yeah,
For
anything
folks
else
who-
with flood
for
mapping
folks-
and like, yeah, go ahead. Mhm.
I was just going to say, for folks who aren't in the chat, First Street Foundation's flood factor mapping is, a really great resource. It used to be freely available and now is behind a paywall. I think you can still put in a specific address and get a report without paying, but that information is takes into account not more than riverine flooding. But a lot of the other resources really are, go into hydraulics and hydrology modeling that can get really complex for these sort of situations.
Appreciate that. I wonder if our speakers have any responses to these answers that we're seeing come up on the screen about what disaster resilience means to you.
I have a quick comment for Andrew. I was noticing 2022 on your slides, and I wanted to see if y'all have tried that rural development 2022 pot of disaster money. And you should probably check that out because it might close that little bit of gap between at least, getting them to rebuild in place, if not all the way to the finish line, couple 100 million more, but there may be some money left in that. And it sounds like 2022 was the Kentucky disaster big year, and you may qualify for some of that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm pretty like compartmentalized from the funding and programmatic side. So I would assume that they are aware of that, but I will follow up with them because that is a big pot of money.
Yeah, I bumped that link up in the chat for anybody.
Well, 50 million was how much they had total, and if it's still posted and it's use it till it's gone, I have no idea how much is left, but it's still posted, so something's left, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not an apply through grants.gov. It's through rural development. You work with your state rural development office. And you mostly focused on the HUD community development block grant. So I didn't know if rural development was one of the folks y'all have been working with, but it might be a good lead for you.
Yeah, we do work with RD a lot, especially with the 502 direct and 502 guaranteed mortgage programs. So we're often in contact with them. Which is just quick plug for 502. It's a great resource. And some of the homes that we're actually conveying to flood victims are, have a 502 affordable loan attached to them, which really helps with affordability for single family.
Thank you so much. Just want to highlight from our poll the number of times that the word community comes up in different iterations. And so just kind of lift up that observation. I think that is probably the through line here. And one of the things I've noticed in doing flood resiliency conversations around the region is that so many communities are, I always say, getting hit in the face with the same frying pan, and yet left alone to find their solutions to that problem, even though the problem is the same from place to place. And so I think the more we can also network across our communities, is both working locally and regionally, is so important. This next question is about what resources do you need to help us shape our work? And so, speaking of community, one of the next events in our series, or the very next event in our series, is going to be talking about community resiliency hubs. And so we'll be showcasing examples of communities and the work that they are doing to have resources in place for when the storm comes. Yeah, Janet, we are familiar with VOAD. We should have them present. And so, yeah, I think one of the questions we have for folks in the room that Janet has led us towards wonderfully is who are the groups that we should be talking to? Who are the groups that we should be having present on these series and making sure that people are working with, aware of, and learning from. So, and then as we noted earlier in the call, Natalie is going to be pulling together a resource bank for folks. And so we're also looking for guidance and ideas for what you all want to see in a resource bank. Thanks, Raina, for those examples. They're great answers. Yes. Funding always. And so I might move us to the next kind of question, because I think there's a little bit of overlap, what are the good projects we should share, good work we can share, the kind of projects you'd like to know more about. So we have FOAD, we have the examples in Baltimore and Erie. Are there other great examples? And I might ask our speakers, do you all have stories of projects that went well, of good examples that you've seen in your work? And the other question I always ask our speakers is, what are things that you have learned that you wish you knew at the start? And so, Natalie, I'll maybe call on you first. Yeah.
On the what I wish I knew, I think one of the things that, like, when we're working in small communities is, we know who the players are in that community, but they get called different things in different communities and have different roles and different overlap. And so understanding how to get the stakeholders in the room using the right language for each community and place. So, like, for example, in health departments in Ohio, you have an emergency preparedness person, but if you're in West Virginia, they're a threat preparedness person, but their job and their role is essentially the same thing. And so, like, trying to, like, kind of have that picture of what things look like across jurisdictions so that you can, speak apples to apples. I'm also, in a minute, I just have to pull it up and actually drop it in the chat. I'm going to share a story map that we developed through a NOAA-funded climate adaptation partnership project. We led an expansion project for Central Appalachia itself, and one of the things we did was tell some small success stories. And so one that I'd love to just highlight very quickly is the Williamsburg Area Response Team, where Williamsburg, West Virginia is an unincorporated community, and so there's not an awful lot of central planning for disaster recovery, nor like a requirement that there be. And so they did a community-led effort to see who needed what, but also who could contribute what. So, who would be willing to cook or provide food, who had backup water, who had a generator, who had a chainsaw or an ATV. And so really going in on the front end to say who is who's willing to contribute instead of doing that after disaster. So I'll drop that link in the chat. I just have to grab it.
Love that. And I love that you have the community has the examples of the questions they asked already. So if somebody wanted to replicate that, they'd have that first step done. Robert or Della, what's something that you learned the hard way that you wish you knew at the start, and or an inspiring story that you've come across?
I didn't really anticipate the quick dry up of federal funds. So that was one of the things that sort of took me by surprise. I mean, we kind of all knew it was going to be bad, but I didn't know it was going to like come to a grinding halt. And I feel like I'm inspired by our network's emphasis on building small resilient I'm in food systems specifically, not specifically kind of disaster mitigation type work so much, but seeing that food systems are such a critical part of that, and kind of knowing we're locked into this collaborative network where on almost like your, emergency phone tree of who's got the chainsaw and who's got the tow hitch and all that, we kind of know amongst each other in this amazing network of practitioners, of lots of industries and lots of different sort of critical society building efforts. And so I know a guy, or if I don't know a guy, I know a guy who knows a guy, and we can rebuild. Okay. So like that's really what keeps me going and keeps me inspired to do the work, because all of y'all really.
Thanks, Stella. I'll add quickly, two things stand out in my last few years of supporting communities build for resiliency. One is the state of Virginia actually has a community flood preparedness funding mechanism to help communities go ahead and start planning and thinking. So if other states don't have funding at the table like that, I think that has become a really great resource, especially as community-based projects around green space development and nature-based projects are starting to be incorporated more. And then I see a lot of people here who are thinking about what other resources are out there to learn about, and a lot of it being in that immediate recovery or response. We had a small community, a coal community called Daint, and this coal community has been thinking about how to just revive their economy and think about different assets that they have. And so one of the things that they built as an asset is a campground that had restroom facilities and a laundry facility for campers. And they weren't thinking about, well, how can we use this facility when it floods? But when it flooded and they received power back on at that facility before surrounding areas received power, they were able to turn this tourist recreation asset into a local people needed asset. So they were able to open it up and have a place where folks who didn't have power could come and take showers and wash their clothes. So again, I think that's just a good example of innovating and adapting in real time.
This last question up on the slide is just if folks have ideas for their mini grant that they want to share with us. Stella, I saw you come off mute. Did I catch that right?
Yeah, I just wanted to tell Robert how much I love that story. I think it's so cool, just the idea of the campground becoming this sort of primitive survival. I think it's neat. I think it's cool.
And Andrew, I wonder if Fahi or you personally have any examples of things that, maybe y'all learned the hard way that you'd like to just tell people right off so they can save the trouble of learning the hard way. Any interesting lessons that have come through? I know you presented on a lot, so if nothing's on top, that's great.
I spoke with our director of disaster resilience, who's kind of coordinating all of our flood recovery activities, and including like the consulting kind of work that we're doing. And I asked him if he had any message he would convey to like local officials about disaster response, et cetera. And he just kind of said, you know, you just it probably goes without saying, really, but you have to be really actively engaged, and you have to actively seek out help, because everyone's overwhelmed. Your neighboring communities are overwhelmed. Your nonprofit infrastructure is overwhelmed. Your churches are overwhelmed. The state is overwhelmed. So just making sure that you take every call, participate in every roundtable, you know, be pestering the state, constantly for like, hey, we have X numbers of homes damaged, and like, what are you going to do for me? Because he saw that the communities who were most actively engaged and most consistently at the table were the ones who ended up getting the most help. And the opposite being true for the ones who kind of took the attitude of like sit back and see what happens. Not to mention, just be doing intake as much as possible. Do like as soon as the disaster happens, like start getting people's information, compiling all of that information, because that will then influence the funding that is available to you, whether through FEMA or through CDBGDR, through SBA. It's really important to have a very solid like idea of the exact number of people affected, households affected, structures affected, etc. So that might seem obvious, but it's very easy to get so caught up in the like need to like muck out and to remove the trees that are in the middle of the road and stuff. But you do also need to be focusing on documenting the needs that are there from day one following a disaster.
I think that's so important. And I think it ties in really nicely with Sharon's question in the chat, which is using asset mapping to learn strengths and resources that neighbors can leverage during disasters. If people have examples for that or tools for that they'd like to share, or maybe that's something, Natalie, to add to the resource kit. But I think having that asset mapping in place and the plan in place, like you named, Andrew, then because there are people who can muck out basements and there are people who cannot muck out basements, right? And so if you know in place some of these, I don't know how to use a chainsaw, right? So I'm not going to be able to get that tree out of the middle of your road, but maybe I can help with some of the data work, right? So I think that goes back to that asset mapping. So yeah, I don't know if anybody has any examples, but I really just want to appreciate Sharon's question. That's a great one for community preparation. I know we're near the end of our time. Yeah, Robert, you call it right back to that mini grant. That's a great mini grant application. And I want to say too, if you have ideas for mini grants and you need resources and tools, like I'm sure you saw in Natalie's presentation, a lot of the materials are already being collected. They're just kind of sifting through them. So be in touch and we can say, oh, we have that, or we don't have that. And so absolutely, we are a community, right? We're a network. I don't know if any of our speakers have any last comments. I'm really enjoying these ideas for the mini projects that are coming into the document. So I hope we see those applications. I also just want to say, I think if Kim is still on the call, the Central Appalachian Network does have regular calls that plan this work, that's planning these webinar series, that's helping plan the mini grant program. And those are open. It's a network. So if you all are interested in getting more involved, please be in touch. We'll have that information in the follow-up email, but yeah, this is and then the Flood Policy Network also has a month every other month call that is it's really just focused on sort of legislation and federal level policy versus some of the other work that through Central Appalachia Network is more focused on kind of on the ground resiliency and how communities can come together. So the work is happening at multiple levels. So like there's whether you're doing a chainsaw or you're doing the data work, we got a place for you. So, all right. Any last questions or any comments from our speakers as we move towards the end of our time this afternoon?
I just want to say I have done the sort of local version, neighborhood version of the local asset mapping, where I know whomst among my friends to call on at what point of the zombie apocalypse. I still need a better seamstress than me, but every other work is covered. You know who your friends are with the skills, and I think that's sort of a smaller version of this concept of the local asset mapping.
I love that. And Della, I'll be on your team. What's up, Robert?
Yeah, I just want to build on that. I think, one of the things that I'm really taking away from a basic level is that, yes, it's a collective act to make our communities more resilient, to engage in that process of preparing, absorbing, recovering, and adapting. But at the individual household level, it's also so important that we think about those things, because as we as families and neighborhoods become more resilient, we're able to offer more resiliency back to our larger community, and we're able to model what it looks like to have collective action. So I'm being reminded to myself that I can be more prepared, I can be more supportive, and I can be more of a drumbeat for adaptation in my own life and community.
That's a fantastic note to end on, I think. Yeah, I really appreciate that sentiment. So one last round of thank you for the Central Appalachia Network, for the climate resilience team and the disaster resilience team for helping pull this together. And like I said, we'll send out an email with all of the information, and in that email, there'll be information on how to get more involved in shaping all this. And I know, I know from that first slide that so many folks on this call have seen these disasters firsthand. So let's make sure our communities are working together. So thanks to all our speakers, and thanks to everyone else for coming.